Hello, friends, and thank you for joining me for another short talk. And friends, enough of the hysteria. There are about 3 social media rabbis that basically exist just to stir things up and get you all hyped up over nothing. And the hysteria I want to cover tonight is the craziness spewed about wigs. And the reason I felt I should comment on yet another hysteria coming from these specific rabbis is because of the cheapening of the phrase Chilul Hashem, a desecration of my God's holy name. Really, if this is a Chilul Hashem, what phrase are you going to use when God's name is actually being desecrated? And I tell this to Jews all the time. If you're going to call anyone you disagree with, let's say a Nazi, what are you going to call people who really behave like Nazis? And the list goes on. Amalek, Erev Rav, Kofed, Ovdei Kochavim. Whenever these rabbis come across a teacher they disagree with, the ad hominem attacks flow. And I'll tell you, this typically mainly arises in Sephardi circles for some reason, this primitive approach to anything they differ with. And because the people who follow them are typically Chozrim B'Teshuvah, Gerim, or Gentiles, they really don't know enough to respond, so they just repeat the nonsense. And it's really quite simple. Friends, if you constantly complain about small problems and mislabel them as big problems, or in this case use the phrase we reserve for real atrocities, Chilul Hashem, it is because you are either not knowledgeable enough to notice or not courageous enough to speak out on true desecrations of our Creator's name. And regarding the topic of wigs, look, clearly there were big rabbis that were against women wearing wigs, absolutely. But what you probably didn't know is that the vast majority of the supposed Gedolim were not. Now, if you only get your Torah knowledge from YouTube, you would probably think that only Sephardi poskim are allowed to poskin. But perhaps you should listen to what the other side had to say, their argument, before hopping on the bandwagon. Now, you guys know me. Only because a group says one thing and the second group says another, that won't affect my opinions. So this is why I'm trying to briefly break down this issue and calm all the hysterics. And don't think that only because I'm making this video, I in any way believe that wearing a wig, a sheitel, is the most ideal way or method for a woman to cover. Not at all. Rather, my attempt here is to show that the opponents to wigs have gone too far and have caused many who are new to our religion to go as far as to insult anyone who disagrees with them in this area, as well as the rabbis who happen to differ with their argument. So tonight I really wanted to try to put things in perspective. Now, we have to be very pragmatic when approaching this issue and understand that the war is not against a woman wearing a wig versus a mitpachat or a tichel. No, friends, the war is between a woman covering and not covering. 100%. And if you don't realize this, you do not live in the Jewish world. And the issue of Indian wigs are only regarding a small segment of the wig industry and not most wigs. But as you probably already know, those against wearing wigs just use the whole India argument as a catalyst to outlaw all wigs. Not to mention that there are many rabbis who have also ruled that halachically what occurs in India doesn't actually usher those wigs in any way. But fine, if you wanted to do away with Indian wigs just for the sake of argument, let's just put that topic aside. Let's first go through a little academic warm-up to properly understand this issue. Now, you first must know that it is a machloket where the requirement to cover actually stems from. Most would agree that perhaps the requirement to cover is from the Torah, Dat Moshe, and how one covers is derabanan, from the rabbis, Dat Yehudit. And this is really the strictest understanding, again, because it's a dispute. And I know the main phrase tossed around the topic of having a kisui rosh is the phrase erva, literally a form of nakedness. Now, this is not the phrase brought down in the Mishnah. No, this is one opinion brought down by an Amara, Rav Sheshet, on why the Mishnah requires women to cover. Actually, the phrase brought down by the Mishnah is Rosh Perua, literally an unkept head of hair. Which is why if you go down to places like Mea Sharem and Geula, you almost see all single girls with their hair in a braid because of the alternative understanding that it's having a head of wild hair that is prohibited. And an interesting way of illustrating the actual halakha that seems to indicate that all women have to cover, not just married women. So this gives you a glimpse into the arguments. Because I know many have a misunderstanding in their ideology, thinking that the reason a woman has to cover is not to look attractive to the rest of the world. And friends, no, that was not the consensus. As a matter of fact, the Shiltil HaGeborim challenges that line of thinking by saying that a married woman has more of an obligation to look attractive to her husband than any sort of obligation, or in this case, rabbinic obligation, to possibly look unattractive to the rest of the world. And I'm pretty sure that's something you never thought about. And if it was true, if a woman's hair has to be covered because it's an edva, friends, for sure it is no longer an edva today, at least regarding stimulation, i.e. getting men to treat her any different than they would treat any other woman. And another question posed that if it was really for this reason is, i.e. because of its attractiveness, why during the Sota ritual are people encouraged to look? They're encouraged to look because it's a shame on her, not necessarily because it's sexually attractive to the people. But regardless, my friends, women still have an obligation to cover, 100%. Or at least 100% that a woman's not to go out with the Rosh Perua. This is the halacha. And as someone who debates religious Jews on the left very much, remember that many, under the advice of Rabbi Mashash, have chosen not to cover at all. Again, because of the factor that we just mentioned. The idea that it is no longer an edva. An idea that I disagree with, actually. And what you should also know is that probably half of all Orthodox women don't cover on a daily basis. Now, there's a lot of women who will wear a hat to shul, but nothing all week long. Not to mention that most hats would also not be allowed by these rabbis, which should really shed light on what we really should be fighting today. And again, that's the idea of covering versus not covering, instead of just constantly repeating the ideal and insulting anyone who has a different approach. I mean, even hats. Most hats would also not be allowed by these rabbis because it's mainly an Ashkenazi opinion that a woman could show some hair. Because as you know, a hat doesn't cover everything. This includes also a snood. And regarding calling this other approach a Chilul Hashem, have they ever asked of the rabbis who allow it? Like Rav Chaim Kanievsky, the Chazon Ish, the Brisker Rav, the Magen Avram, the Shulchan Aruch Harav, Rav Moshe Feinstein, the Prima Gadim, the Mishnah Berurah, and many, many more. I mean, my friends, it's quite idiotic to label something a Chilul Hashem when not just the bulk of influential rabbis allowed it, but you know what? Even the Shulchan Aruch endorses it. And not just the Shulchan Aruch, the Mishnah speaks about women wearing wigs even back then. And even Talmud Bavli mentions in 3 separate places of women wearing wigs back then. Not to mention that even Talmud Yerushalmi quotes it. Now, why is it that these rabbis fail to inform these listeners of this information? Easy, because they don't know. Friends, we have to stop all the hysteria. I mean, you're worrying about wigs when we have bigger issues to worry about. We have a conversion crisis, a shidduch crisis, major issues with our make-believe eruvim, people not keeping Shabbat, men learning all day and having their wives support them. And all I see on YouTube are videos of wigs burning. So yes, lechatchila, a tichel, a mitpachat, seems like the better choice. But if it's hard to cover, like it is for most women, a wig is 100% allowed and fulfills the requirement to cover clearly bediavad. Now, do you still think that you should toss out what I think is the most lenient, acceptable approach to fulfilling this halakha without an all or nothing approach? Because what you will end up is with nothing, with people not wanting to cover. It makes sense. Safek de Rabbanan lehakel. And you must also know that those leading the fight against all wigs, not just Indian ones, are also ignorant of a more important factor And that's that the halacha is crystal clear, both in Shulchan Aruch and in Mishneh Torah, which requires all females to cover, not just married ones. In other words, it's a bigger distortion to say that only married women have to cover than to say that wearing a wig is a chilul Hashem. Friends, for more information on everything Jewish, please visit TorahJudaism.com. Thank you.